Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a conflict where the ultimate victory isn't measured in seized land or, defeated armies, but in mines won over.
Right.
The source material we're diving into today posits that triumph can be achieved without necessarily having received any shots.
That's a pretty fundamental reframing of warfare, isn't it? It immediately prioritizes the human being, their thoughts, beliefs, attitudes. That becomes the core battleground.
Exactly. And this deep dive is centered on a truly unique document, a training manual. It's about psychological operations in guerrilla warfare. What really makes it stand out is its explicit context. It's framed within this idea of a Christian and democratic crusade by groups identified as Freedom Commandos in Nicaragua.
Yeah, that gives it a very specific, maybe even unsettling lens. Our mission today, just to be clear, is to explore this manual impartially.
Right.
We're here to understand its core philosophy, the specific techniques it talks about, especially how it positions psychological operations or psyops as the factor, the one that determines the outcome in this kind of conflict.
We need to stress we're examining the ideas in the document itself. We're not endorsing any viewpoint or action, just, analyzing the strategic mindset it promotes.
Exactly. Analyzing the blueprint.
Right. It's about understanding that blueprint. So where does this manual even begin its strategic thinking? How does it set the stage?
Well, it starts with a really foundational premise. Guerrilla warfare, as they define it, isn't primarily military in the traditional sense. It's fundamentally a political war.
A political war. Okay. How does that change the battlefield? What does that mean in practice?
The manual explains that this perspective, it expands the battlefield way beyond just geographical boundaries. It shifts the focus inward.
Inward.
Yeah, into the political being par excellence, as it calls it, the human being. It even nods to Aristotle's idea of the political animal, suggesting the conflict is deeply tied up with, well, human nature and how we interact socially.
So the real territory being fought over is inside people's heads.
Precisely. And according to this document, the priority objective in this political war is the human being. They are target number one.
And within the human being, what's the bullseye? What's the most critical military target, according to them?
The mind. The manual unequivocally states that once the mind is reached, the political animal is vanquished.
Vanquished. Strong word.
It is. And this is where that striking phrase comes back. This can often happen without necessarily having received any shots. It's all about influencing perception, shaping thought to get the political outcome they want, minimizing, maybe even avoiding, physical combat.
So victory is essentially a psychological conquest. Is that the idea?
That's the core assertion, yeah. The manual characterizes the whole political environment where guerrilla warfare happens as this constant struggle, a struggle to dominate the political mentality that's inherent in every person.
So everyone's political mentality is up for grabs.
Right. And this collective mentality, the shared mindset, according to the document, forms the environment where the ultimate triumph or defeat is decided. Not the jungle, not the mountains, but the collective mind.
Okay, so following from that core idea of political war, mind as the target, what's the manual's big conclusion? How is this kind of conflict actually won?
It explicitly states that this concept makes psychological operations, psyops, the factor determining the results.
Not just a factor, but the factor.
Exactly. It's not just support, like air support or logistics. It's presented as the decisive element, the thing that makes the difference.
PsyOps determines victory. And who are the targets for these crucial operations? Who are they trying to influence?
The document outlines a three-part audience. It's quite comprehensive. Targets our troops, the enemy troops, and the civil population.
So everyone involved. Their own side, the other side, and everyone in between.
Yeah, it's a total approach, aimed at influencing everyone connected to or potentially caught up in the conflict.
And just to anchor this again, remind us this isn't some abstract theory floating around. This was for a specific situation, right?
Absolutely. The document is very clear. This is a training guide specifically developed for that Christian and democratic crusade, supposedly carried out by the Freedom Commandos in Nicaragua. It's applying these, broader principles to a very real, specific conflict scenario.
Okay. So if the mind is the primary target and PsyOps is the deciding factor, how do they actually do this on the ground? It can't just be like a small team hidden away somewhere broadcasting messages, can it?
No, that's one of the most critical aspects, actually.
Yeah.
The manual stresses maximizing the socio-psychological impact by transforming each individual guerrilla fighter
Transforming them.
into a propagandist, in addition to being a combatant.
Wow. Every soldier is also a psychological operator.
Precisely. That's the goal. The manual acknowledges that the typical guerrilla environment, remote, mobile, usually doesn't have fancy psyops facilities.
Right, no broadcast towers in the jungle.
Exactly. So effective face-to-face persuasion by individual guerrillas becomes absolutely essential. It has to be baked into the entire fighting force, not just a specialist unit.
Okay, but to be an effective propagandist, you have to really understand what you're pushing, right? What you're advocating for. How do they build that understanding within the ranks?
Political awareness is presented as just paramount, absolutely key. The manual says it must be as sharp as the guerrilla's combat skills.
As important as knowing how to shoot straight.
Yeah, because it provides the fundamental justification, the reason for the struggle. If the fighters don't really grasp the political why, they can't possibly persuade others effectively.
Makes sense. So how do they cultivate that awareness, that motivation? What are the methods?
The document details two main methods used during training and also during operations: group dynamics and self-criticism.
Okay, let's start with group dynamics. How does that work in practice?
Well, they hold group discussions, usually within small units like squadrons. The manual claims this increases unit spirit, builds unity of thought.
Gets everyone on the same page.
Right, and it also applies social pressure on, let's say, weaker or less committed members to kind of shape up, to improve their performance and alignment.
And what are they actually discussing in these groups? What's the content?
They focus on very specific narrative points. For instance, using history, national, local, to paint the Sandinista regime as foreign, repressive, imperialistic.
Framing the enemy.
Exactly. Even Nicaraguans within that government are supposed to be portrayed as puppets of foreign powers, like the Soviets or Cubans. But the approach is kept local. International stuff is only brought in to support local events or grievances.
Keep it relevant to the people they're talking to.
Right. The main goal pushed is national unification, but only through defeating the Sandinista forces. And they promote the movement's own platform as pluralist, emphasizing liberty, equality, better economy, opportunities, true democracy for all.
So they're explicitly teaching a specific political narrative, a story, and linking it directly to the grievances they believe people are feeling.
Yes, absolutely. They also guide discussions to highlight the supposed injustices of the Sandinista system, and, crucially, to convince the guerrillas themselves that popular support, the population's opinion, is the determining factor for victory.
So internal motivation linked to external perception.
Exactly. Without the population on their side, the manual insists victory is just impossible. These discussions reinforce that winning hearts and minds is as vital as winning battles.
And what about the other method, self-criticism?
Self-criticism sort of complements this. It provides a framework for constructive evaluation within the group. It reinforces each individual's positive responsibility to the group mission. It's about solidifying commitment, making sure everyone feels personally invested and aligned with the cause.
Okay, what about the practical side? How are these discussions run?
The manual advises dividing the force into small units, as I mentioned. A political cadre or maybe the unit leader guides the discussion.
Or like a facilitator.
Sort of, but more like a tutor. They're not meant to lecture, but to help members express opinions and then guide them towards the correct conclusions, as the manual puts it.
Guiding them. Sounds a bit leading.
It does. Serious differences get reported up the command chain, maybe clarified in larger meetings, and cadres are told to live, eat, work, fight with the guerrillas, share their conditions to build trust and cooperation.
Living the life, not just talking about it.
Right. And the location matters too. Whenever possible, hold these discussions in towns, in populated areas, not just hidden away in camps.
Why there?
It's intended to emphasize the revolutionary nature of the struggle, to show the guerrillas are among the people, sharing their objectives. The manual has this interesting line: the guerrilla focuses on the people, the cadre focuses on the guerrilla, but they live together to forge this unity of revolutionary thought.
It sounds like a really relentless process. Constant psychological conditioning and narrative control right from within the unit itself.
It is. The desired outcome, the ideal guerrilla, according to this manual, is someone who can persuasively justify their actions to anyone, but especially to themselves and their fellow fighters, even while enduring, the immense hardships of guerrilla life, hunger, cold, fear.
Can you give us that specific example from the source, the one about persuasive power?
Yeah, it's quite telling. The manual states that the ideal result is a guerrilla who can give, say, 5 or 10 logical reasons why a peasant should give them supplies, like fabric, a needle, thread, simple things.
Okay.
This practical face-to-face persuasion is seen as crucial. The manual claims that a guerrilla behaving this way prevents enemy propaganda from successfully painting them as terrorists in the eyes of the population.
That's a very tangible measure of success, isn't it? Being able to talk someone into giving you thread.
It is. And the manual connects this constant psychological orientation directly to how guerrillas endure physical hardship. It says hunger, cold, fatigue, insecurity. They gain meaning in the struggle because of this continuous orientation. It gives purpose to the suffering. Even practical camp procedures, digging latrines, setting up drainage, watch posts, they're also framed as contributing to motivation and cooperation. They provide tangible evidence of belonging, which is essential for morale when you're facing danger and anxiety constantly.
So everything feeds back into morale and the mission.
Right. Sharing duties, striking camp together, it all strengthens unit cohesion, esprit de corps, and this unity of thought. Good physical and psychological condition are needed, reinforced by these discussions and self-criticism.
So even the most mundane tasks get linked back to the psychological mission, which I guess leads us neatly into this concept of armed propaganda.
Yes, armed propaganda. Now, the manual is quick to clarify this. It says it's often misunderstood.
How so?
People might think it means using force, like propaganda of the deed, through violence. The manual explicitly rejects this. It states it does not involve force.
Okay, so what is it then?
Instead, it defines armed propaganda as essentially every action performed by an armed force that results in a better attitude from the people towards that force. And crucially, without forced indoctrination.
So actions by armed fighters that passively build positive feelings, not forcing beliefs, but shaping attitudes through behavior.
Exactly. The manual emphasizes that guerrillas have to deeply understand its principles and the core method, close identification with the people.
Identification, what does that look like on the ground? Give us some examples.
Okay, examples include things like guerrillas hanging up their arms temporarily and working side by side with peasants in the fields.
Really? Like helping with the harvest?
Yeah, building things, fishing, carrying water, fixing roofs, practical help. They use slogans alongside this, like many hands doing small things but doing them together. The idea is this participation builds strong bonds, generates genuine popular support.
Actions speaking louder than words.
And guerrilla conduct in or near towns is also key. Being respectful, polite, cautious, ready, yes, but not suspicious or hostile. The manual even says, even in war, it is possible to smile, laugh, and greet people.
Showing they're human, relatable, respectful, not just fighters bringing disruption.
Yes, emphasizing that the reason for their fight is the people, and they must always show respect. Another tactic mentioned is engaging youth during rests.
Oh.
Explaining their weapons, letting youth or even children handle unloaded rifles, assemble, disassemble, aim at imaginary targets. This is framed explicitly as attracting potential recruits.
Wow, starting young.
And they use simple slogans to explain the purpose of the arms.
Yeah.
To win freedom, they are for you. These are your arms. To set demands like hospitals or schools. To change the regime for democracy and economic opportunity.
So constantly presenting the weapons not as tools of the guerrillas against the people, but as tools for the people's liberation and betterment, making people feel the arms belong to them.
That's the core message they want to convey. The arms are the strength of the people against an oppressive regime. However...
There's always a however.
Right. The manual does acknowledge that the mere presence of an armed force inherently creates implicit terror. People naturally fear that those arms could be used against them.
That makes sense. Guns are scary.
And it also notes, quite strategically, that if the existing government police can't stop the guerrillas, the population loses confidence in the government's ability to protect them, which is a psychological win for the guerrillas.
So the government's failure becomes their gain in terms of public trust or lack thereof?
Exactly. But, and this is crucial, the guerrillas must absolutely avoid becoming an explicit terror, because that, the manual warns, causes the loss of public support, which they see as essential.
So implicit fear is okay, maybe even useful, but explicit terror is counterproductive.
Precisely. The manual quotes another guerrilla leader saying the population is impressed by arms not out of fear, but because they give a feeling of strength. That feeling of strength, not fear, that is the stated goal of armed propaganda.
That's a very subtle, maybe even cynical line they're trying to walk there. The manual also gets really specific about how armed propaganda works during active town occupations, doesn't it?
It does. It lists specific actions that should happen simultaneously when an armed force occupies a neutral or passive town.
Okay, like what?
First, destroy enemy military or police installations, secure any survivors, cut external communication lines, phone, telegraph, set ambushes on roads leading into town.
Standard military tactics, securing the area.
Yes, but then it blends into the psyops. Kidnap Sandinista officials and agents, replace them with their own trusted personnel right there in public places, establish a public court dependent on the guerrillas, and gather the population.
Taking physical and administrative control very publicly.
And then comes the public shaming. They target personal symbols of the regime officials, collaborators, and shame, ridicule, humiliate them in front of the gathered people.
Humiliation as a weapon.
And the manual mentions a specific tactic: using planted guerrillas within the crowd, yelling slogans and taunts to promote popular participation, to make the outrage seem spontaneous, coming from the people themselves.
Orchestrating the mob.
They also expose weaknesses of regime sympathizers and remove them from town, but without causing public damage. It's about removing their influence, maybe more subtly.
So, targeted removal alongside public spectacle. What else?
While all this is happening, the other guerrillas are instructed to mix with the population. They have to demonstrate very good conduct.
Good conduct, meaning?
Things like paying cash for any article taken, accepting hospitality if offered, and exploiting that opportunity for face-to-face persuasion. Paying courtesy calls on prominent local citizens, doctors, priests, teachers.
Building rapport, showing discipline and respect amidst the takeover.
Exactly. And here's a particularly fascinating counterintuitive detail. The manual tells the guerrillas to instruct the population after the operation to reveal everything to the returning Sandinista forces.
Tell the enemy everything. Weapon types, numbers, where they went. Why on earth would they do that?
It's framed as a deliberate act of defiance. The manual says they should state it's because we are not afraid of anything or anyone, or either the Soviets or the Cubans.
Projecting absolute confidence.
Right. It emphasizes they are Nicaraguans fighting for a Nicaraguan government, independent and fearless. They also tell the population that in meetings or private chats, they can give the names of Sandinista informers who will then be removed.
Gathering intelligence while projecting strength?
The public meetings conclude with speeches. A dynamic leader or cadre gives a speech reinforcing these messages. Their own Christian guerrillas' generosity in not mistreating captured enemies, thanking the population for their hospitality and risks, highlighting the regime's weakness and exploitation, taxes, controls, promising to return, and again, reiterating their fearlessness.
Wow. It's a complete performance, isn't it? Designed to create a very specific image. A disciplined, confident force, aligned with the people, utterly fearless of the regime or its foreign backers.
That's precisely the goal of armed propaganda in action, as described here. The manual insists the arms are the strength of the people, not a power over the people.
Okay, but things can go wrong. What about handling negative incidents? Like, if someone gets shot during one of these operations, the manual provides a very detailed scenario for that, doesn't it?
It does. If a citizen is shot trying to leave an occupied town, the manual outlines a specific narrative to push immediately.
What's the narrative?
First, frame the danger. Claim the escape would have alerted the enemy, leading to terrible reprisals, rape, pillage, captures, terror inflicted on the hospitable townspeople. The victim, therefore, must be seen as an enemy of the people.
Blame the victim? Frame them as endangering the community.
Then, justify the shot itself. Say it was necessary to protect the citizens, that it was the guerrillas' primordial duty. Claim the commando tried to stop the person non-violently first and only shot against his own will to prevent greater harm to innocent people.
Making it sound reluctant, unavoidable, and for the greater good.
Then shift the blame further. Say the regime's repressive system really killed the informant, and make a point of mentioning the weapon used was captured from the regime.
So even the weapon is turned into a symbol against the regime. Every detail is used to spin the narrative.
Absolutely. Finally, express Christian feeling. Express pain at having to kill a Nicaraguan brother, but blame the repression, corruption, and foreign powers for forcing them to take up arms. State the death would have been avoided if justice and freedom, the guerrilla objectives, already existed.
That level of scripted response, ready to go for such a specific event, really shows how deeply embedded narrative control is in this whole strategy. The manual also discusses something called the selective use of violence for propaganda effects. What's that about?
This involves neutralizing. And the manual clarifies neutralize means remove, though it avoids the word kill, directly specific targets.
Remove. Okay, who are the targets?
They list court judges, cattle judges, police and security officers, local party CDS chiefs, etc. Specific figures of authority or control.
And how is this done for propaganda effect?
For maximum psychological effect, The manual says the affected population should be gathered to attend the removal, even participate, perhaps by formulating accusations against the target beforehand.
Public removal, public participation, or at least the appearance of it.
Yes. And the selection criteria are crucial here. They say you should only target someone based on existing spontaneous hostility from the majority of the population. Use the hate or rejection that's already there.
So tap into existing grievances.
Crucially, it explicitly states not to provoke this if the majority actually supports the target. That would backfire. Selection also considers who might replace the person, the level of violence needed. It must be seen as acceptable by the population, and the foreseeable reprisals the population might suffer afterwards.
Very calculated.
And after the action, extensive explanation is required, justifying why it was necessary for the people's good, framing any Sandinista reprisals as unfair, which further justifies the initial action. They must carefully sound out and control the population's reaction to make sure it benefits the Freedom Commandos.
Calculating the psychological fallout and actively managing it.
Right. So armed propaganda, through all these actions, the helpful ones, the intimidating ones, the controlled violence, the careful narrative spin is presented as the most effective instrument available to a guerrilla force, precisely because it aims to build positive attitudes without overt force or forced indoctrination.
Okay, so that covers individual fighters as propagandists and the general concept of armed propaganda actions. But the manual also describes dedicated units for this work, right? Armed propaganda teams, EPO.
Yes, exactly. EPA Equipos de Propaganda Armada. These are described as mobile units used by commanders for maximum psychological results. They're designed to work in contact with the very reality of their roots within the population.
Goes to the ground.
Very. They combine political consciousness raising with armed propaganda, using carefully selected guerrillas who are good at personal, face-to-face persuasion.
So these are the elite persuaders. What's the key thing about these teams? Is it the training?
Interestingly, the manual emphasizes that personnel selection is more important than the training program itself.
Selection over training.
Yeah. They need people with natural persuasive power in informal chats, plus combat capability. They need ardor and fervor, but also people who are intellectually cultivated and agile. Team size is small, 6-10 members, which is seen as ideal for camaraderie, solidarity, quick reaction, and the leader. The most politically motivated and effective persuader, not necessarily the highest military rank.
Fascinating. Where do they find these persuasive, agile, fervent people?
Recruitment targets the exact same social groups they want to influence. Peasants, students, professionals, housewives. They look for people already experiencing specific frustrations. The movement can exploit peasants lacking land, workers facing factory closures, maybe doctors displaced by Cuban medics or lacking medicines. And crucially, they need skill in public expression. The selection process is about identifying those with the greatest natural capacity for this kind of work.
Got it. So how are they trained if selection is more important?
The training is intensive, just 14 days, but it focuses on method, not specific content learned by rote.
Method, not message.
Right. It uses team discussions, where members take turns leading. They practice discussing various topics relevant to local conditions and potential grievances. Crops, fertilizer, seeds, irrigation, lumber, tools, transport animals, local problems with the regime, taxes, forced labor, forced associations, consumer goods prices, issues with schools, Cuban teachers, lack of religious freedom, priest persecution. The list is long. Teams can develop other topics too.
All topics designed to tap into potential local frustrations.
Exactly. The manual notes that the target groups aren't politically sophisticated, generally forming opinions from what they see and hear directly. So the EPA teams are trained to use specific persuasion methods.
Like what?
Leveraging psychological principles, like the internal group, external group idea, framing the Sandinistas as external false, while the Freedom Commandos are internal true. This has to be subtle, seems spontaneous.
Us versus them.
Pretty much. Also, applying the political science principle that against is easier than for. So focus campaigns against the government and its sympathizers, giving people specific targets for their frustrations.
Easier to unite against something than for something complex.
That's the idea. And targeting primary groups, family, friends, colleagues, because sociological principles say opinions are really formed and reinforced in those close-knit groups. EPA members must associate within these primary groups.
Get inside the trusted circles. What about actual speaking techniques?
They emphasize keeping it simple, concise, using popular language, avoiding difficult words. Oratory is for understanding, not showing off. Use vivid, realistic, concrete examples, children playing, horses galloping, not abstract ideas. Use gestures effectively, hands, body language, facial expressions, match the tone to the subject, and above all, be natural. Avoid imitation, project your own personality.
These teams sound like they'd be incredibly valuable for gathering information too, not just spreading it, like sensitive antennas up in the community.
The manual absolutely describes them that way. They are the movements, eyes, and ears, generating intelligence on enemy activities, but also on popular support, sympathy, or hostility towards the guerrillas. Reports go up to the chiefs.
So intelligence gathering is part of the job.
Yes, but, and the manual stresses this, their primary mission is PSYOPs, not intelligence gathering. Intelligence reports should be passed via external contact to avoid compromising the population if an EPA member is caught. But EPA cadres are seen as uniquely capable of personally determining shifts in popular support.
It makes sense. They're right there having the conversations.
And this program, the manual argues, increases the whole guerrilla group's capacity to obtain and use information. It allows for more precise planning based on real conditions on the ground. EPA can even penetrate areas where combat units don't control.
Expanding the movement's reach psychologically even where it can't militarily. Does the manual connect this to anything historically?
It does. It draws a direct parallel to fifth column tactics used in World War II.
Fifth columns, like spies and saboteurs.
More like internal subversion and influence networks. The manual specifically mentions Germany's invasions of Poland, Belgium, Holland, France, Norway, stating the effectiveness of those tactics was clearly demonstrated and can be used by the Freedom Commandos.
That's a pretty stark comparison.
It is. The manual acknowledges the risks involved in EPA work, but says they're no greater than other guerrilla activities. And it emphasizes that EPA are essential for the struggle's success. Like, scouts are the eyes and ears of a patrol, EPA are the antennas finding and exploiting the socio-political weaknesses of the enemy and the population.
Okay, so we've got motivated individual fighters, armed actions, building support, these specialized persuasion teams burrowing into communities. What about organizing broader support structures, taking it beyond individual persuasion?
That leads directly into the section on the development and control of front organizations. This is described as an essential process for the insurrection, particularly the urban aspect, which runs parallel to the rural guerrilla campaign.
Front organizations, creating the appearance of broad popular support through groups that look independent but are actually controlled, like a facade.
That's exactly the term the manual uses, a facade organization. And the control is meant to be concealed, what it calls subjective internal control, exercised through hidden internal cadres.
How do they recruit people into these, especially for the hidden control part?
The manual details several methods. Some are involuntary.
Involuntary?
Yes. It describes setting up private consultations where a target meets with a cadre they don't know is a cadre. Later, the target is informed they're now considered in the movement and face risks from the government police if they don't cooperate.
That sounds like straight-up coercion. Blackmail, almost.
It certainly reads that way. Then there's voluntary recruitment, identifying potential sympathizers through EPA contacts or direct visits from leaders' cadres. Once reliability is checked through minor missions, these voluntary recruits are instructed to recruit others within specific target groups, political parties, unions, youth groups, farmers, etc.
Widening the net.
To do this, they're told to find out personal habits, preferences, aversions, even weaknesses of potential recruits, often through acquaintances or just observation. The approach is then made through an acquaintance, developing friendship, and then attracting the target via their preferences or weaknesses. Maybe lunches, drinks, dinners are mentioned. Exploiting those angles.
So exploiting personal connections and vulnerabilities seems key.
It seems so. If someone looks susceptible based on their beliefs, a political cadre is brought in. If they're not susceptible through belief,
then the involuntary route.
The manual suggests arranging accidental meetings with unknown leaders or cadres, making sure other people see the target at this meeting in a bar, a park bench, someone's house. Then confront the target with their supposed involvement. Threaten exposure to the police if they don't cooperate or follow orders.
Wow, that's elaborate deception and threat.
It even mentions the possibility of sending a fake letter to the police, supposedly from uninvolved citizens, denouncing the target, though it adds a note of caution about protecting the covert recruiter. Involvement is then gradual, through increasingly sensitive clandestine missions, to build commitment and prevent confessions if caught. The ultimate goal is successful infiltration of any key target group for internal control over the enemy's societal structure.
A calculated mix of friendship, manipulation, and outright threat. What about established citizens, professionals, business owners?
People like doctors, lawyers, businessmen, landowners, even minor officials are recruited specifically for subjective internal control of the groups they already belong to.
Okay, what does that mean, subjective internal control?
After recruitment and vetting, they're given specific instructions to influence their groups. The method recommended is Socratic dialectics.
Like Plato, asking questions.
Kind of. The idea is that knowledge or feeling is inherent to the person or group's position. The cadre, or the influence member, introduces a topic, a word, a thought related to the persuasion goal, but just via a casual remark in conversation.
Planting seeds subtly.
Yes. The manual gives examples. For economic groups, exploit frustration about profit limits, taxes, costs the cadre subtly increases this feeling. For political aspirants, exploit feelings of unjust discrimination, lack of opportunity, the cadre channels discussion towards this frustration. For social or intellectual critics, exploit feelings of being ignored, censorship, the cadre demonstrates this injustice in meetings.
Amplifying existing discontent.
Exactly. After these frustrations are established and amplified, the hostility is gradually transferred onto the regime or the system itself. The key is the cadre maintains a low-key presence, so the hostile feelings seem spontaneous, arising naturally from the group members, not like it was suggested by the cadre. That's subjective internal control.
Making manipulated dissent look entirely organic.
Right. And the hostility generated should initially be generalized anti-government feeling, not necessarily pro-movement at first, though a pro-movement feeling develops, they use it. The main goal at this stage is preparing these target groups for later incorporation into mass organizations.
Laying the groundwork, how do they manage security for these internal cadres?
They're organized into 3-person cells. Only one member of each cell has contact outside the cell. They meet frequently for orders, relaying information, encouragement, morale boosting, and self-criticism focused on their subjective control missions. It's designed as a secure, two-way communication network, highly compartmentalized. Members don't even reveal the identity of their operational cell contact in coordination meetings, only the nature of their activity, e.g. political party work. There's a coordination element linking back to zone commanders.
Very cellular, classic clandestine structure. So this infiltration and subjective control eventually leads to creating the actual front organization.
Yes, this happens in the final stages of the operation, closely linked with planned mass meetings. It occurs when armed action has spread. EPA reports show clear popular support, target groups been successfully infiltrated, and preparation for mass meetings is complete.
The culmination of all that groundwork.
At that point, the internal cadres start discussions within their groups about the need to merge forces, to create this facade organization. They continue raising awareness. Maybe a cadre in a teacher's group reports growing discontent among farmers they heard about, fostering a sense that everyone is getting angrier.
Creating a feedback loop, a perception of widespread rising anger.
Then come the formal steps. Internal cadres meet with leaders of other groups, presidents, etc., maybe presided over by the movement's chief of organization. They issue a joint communiqué announcing the creation of the facade organization, listing names, signatures, represented groups. And immediately after this announcement, they initiate mass meetings aimed at destroying the Sandinista control system.
So the front organization becomes the public vehicle, built upon layers of hidden control and manipulation, ready to mobilize the masses.
Exactly. It provides the movement, as the manual puts it, with the capability of creating a backlash effect. This combination of infiltration and subjective control, running parallel to all the other activities, allows a commander to literally shake up and replace the existing Sandinista structure.
Which leads us directly into the next logical step, controlling those mass meetings and concentrations.
Right. Described as a powerful psychological instrument, especially in the last stages of the struggle, crucial for mission execution.
And it relies heavily on that prior infiltration and preparation.
Absolutely. Cadres have already infiltrated unions, youth groups, peasant organizations to precondition them. The purpose is to act among the masses, clandestinely proselytizing for the struggle. They've worked to develop a hostile mental attitude in these target groups in advance,
Priming the pump for anger.
so that anger can, at the crucial moment, turn into violence, demanding rights allegedly taken by the regime. The targets for this preconditioning are broad. Political parties, professional orgs, students, workers, the unemployed, ethnic minorities, any sector deemed vulnerable or recruitable, even just general masses and sympathizers.
How do they create that hostile attitude? What specifics does the manual give?
It involves creating a very negative image using charged language, describing government entity managers as slave drivers, police as the communist Gestapo, officials of the Government of National Reconstruction as lackeys of Cuban Soviet imperialism. Very evocative, demonizing language.
Painting the enemy in the worst possible light.
They also use what the manual calls temporary compulsive obsessions. This means hammering specific topics relentlessly in mass concentrations, meetings, informal conversations, maybe using editorials or radio. The goal is to condition people's thinking for that decisive moment when general violence is desired.
Constant repetition of key negative messages.
Yes. Making people believe taxes don't benefit them, but are just for exploitation and enrichment of officials. Making them see themselves as slaves exploited by privileged groups. Framing foreign advisors as interventionists, exploiting the nation for Soviet-Cuban goals, turning the people into slaves of the hammer and sickle.
Very strong, emotionally charged framing. What about slogans for these mass meetings?
Slogans are key for mobilizing the masses, getting them to the highest emotional level. Initially, when the insurrection starts, covert cadres push partial demands based on immediate daily needs.
Like what?
Things like, we want food, we want religious freedom, we want labor union freedom. Simple, relatable demands.
Connecting to tangible grievances first.
Right. These partial steps are meant to lead towards the movement's ultimate goals, summarized as God, country, and democracy. If the enemy authority seems disorganized and the people are getting excited, agitators are told to raise the slogans to the highest pitch, more radical demands.
Escalating the rhetoric when the mood is right.
But if the masses aren't really excited yet, they stick to the partial slogans based on daily needs, always linking them back to the movement's broader goals. The manual emphasizes simplicity here.
How so?
It says, few people think in terms of millions of pesos, but anyone understands that shoes are a necessity. Ideological goals exist, but agitators must remember that food and basic needs, bread and butter, or as the manual puts it, tortilla and heap, are what win people over. That's their primary mission in sloganeering.
Focus on the gut-level needs. How do they actually get the crowd started? The nuclei.
They mobilize a specific number of agitators from the guerrilla organization within a village or area. This initial group attracts others, the curious, adventurers, the generally dissatisfied. Guerrillas also attract sympathizers, people discontented due to regime repression. Maybe they were robbed, imprisoned, tortured.
Building a core group of motivated individuals.
These groups are then mobilized to target areas, specifically where criminal and hostile FSLN or CDS, Sandinista Defense Committee, elements live. There's an effort to go armed, but usually with non-firearms. Clubs, iron bars, placards, small firearms might be concealed.
Armed, but maybe not lethally for intimidation.
And here's another chilling detail. The manual says, if possible, hire professional criminals for specific jobs. Also hire unemployed people for unspecified jobs. This creates a nucleus that is under absolute orders.
Hiring criminals to participate in demonstrations. That's explicit.
It is. Logistics are also planned. Designated cadres arrange transport private or public vehicles, boats. Others prepare placards, flags, banners with a variety of slogans ready, partial, transitory, radical. Still others prepare leaflets, posters, handbills, pamphlets containing instructions for participants, and anti-regime material.
Everything is meticulously planned and prepared in advance.
Everything. And then there's the section on creating a martyr.
Creating a martyr, you mean deliberately?
That's what the manual describes. Assigning specific elements within the demonstration to deliberately lead demonstrators into confrontation with authorities. The explicit goal is to provoke riots or shootings that lead to death or deaths.
Intentionally sacrificing people for propaganda value.
These individuals then become martyrs for the cause. Their deaths must be exploited immediately against the regime to create greater conflicts, fuel more anger.
That's incredibly cynical. How do they describe actually carrying out an uprising or a large demonstration?
The core idea is using a relatively small group of infiltrated guerrillas acting as agitators to give the impression of numerous and widespread popular support.
Making a small group look huge.
Right. The manual gives figures. Tactics using 200, 300 agitators can apparently create a demonstration of 10,000 to 20,000 people. The process involves agitation based on socio-political objectives. Highly trained covert agents participate, involving innocent people to make the protest seem spontaneous. But these agents direct the entire meeting.
So it's not spontaneous at all. It's a performance directed from within. What's the command structure for this?
It's detailed. There's an external command, staying outside the main activities, observing from a high point, a church steeple, tall building, tree, stadium tier.
Watching from above.
Then, internal command, inside the crowd. Their job is to protect the leaders. They use placards and banners as mobile command posts and for signaling to subunits. They're told to avoid placing themselves right where fights start.
Directing, but staying out of the direct fray.
Key agitators are placed strategically inside the crowd, near assigned placards, partly to protect them from opponents. The commander knows where these agitators are and sends them orders, maybe change slogans, encourage violence. Agitators are also told to avoid disturbance areas once they've kicked off.
Specialist roles.
Yes. There's a defense detachment, moving bodyguards, guerrillas in civilian clothes, or maybe those hired recruits. They form a protective circle around the chief, help with escape if needed. They're described as highly disciplined, only using violence on verbal order. They should behave orderly during things like religious events or funerals.
Protecting the leadership.
Messengers are crucial, staying close to leaders to transmit orders via radio, phone, vehicles, or just on foot or horseback using trails. Young adolescents are considered ideal for this role.
Using teenagers as messengers in potentially violent situations.
Then you have the shock troops. These are equipped with non-firing weapons. The manual lists knives, razors, chains, clubs, sticks. They march behind the innocent participants, concealing their weapons initially.
Shock troops with melee weapons, what's their role?
They act as reinforcement if the primary agitators are attacked or neutralized. Their appearance is meant to be sudden, violent, and surprising, distracting authorities and allowing the internal command to retreat or escape if necessary.
Creating chaos at a specific moment.
You also have placard and banner carriers. Initially, they express the basic complaints. Then, at the peak moment of euphoria or dissatisfaction, they switch to pro-cause or anti-regime slogans. These carriers are infiltrated covertly. They stay near their placards to protect them. The commander can order slogan changes through them, encourage violence.
Controlling the messaging visually.
And finally, watchword and applause agitators. They have specific instructions, rehearsed watchwords like, "We're hungry, we want bread, we don't want communism." The manual compares them to high school cheerleaders. Their objective isn't just to shout, but to gain genuine supporters through their enthusiasm and direction.
So it's not a spontaneous protest at all. It's a highly controlled, meticulously planned, and manipulated event designed to look like a popular uprising.
That's certainly the picture the manual paints. It concludes this section by stating that mass gatherings and protest demonstrations are essential elements for destroying the enemy structure in a revolutionary movement.
Okay. We've covered a huge amount of ground here. The individual fighter as propagandist, armed actions to build support, the specialized EPA teams, creating and controlling front organizations, manipulating mass demonstrations. How does the manual pull all these threads together? What's the summary?
The final section really emphasizes the interconnectedness. It recaps these key components we've discussed.
Yeah.
The motivation of the propagandist-combatant, armed propaganda making weapons seem like the people's power. The EPA is mobile antennas, the cover organizations for backlash, and the control of mass demos using agitators.
Bringing it all together.
And then it makes a crucial point. It states that viewing guerrilla war only from the perspective of combat is erroneous and dangerous. Combat, it says, is only one of 6 basic efforts.
Only one of 6? And the other 5 are basically the psychological and organizational ones we've just discussed.
Potentially, yes. Motivation, armed propaganda, EPA, front orgs, mass control. Combat is the 6th, though this specific manual doesn't detail combat tactics itself, focusing almost entirely on the psychological and political dimensions.
So 5 out of the 6 core efforts laid out here are explicitly psychological or directly related to population influence and control.
That really highlights the document's central argument, doesn't it? And the core principle it lays down is this. None of these 6 efforts bears a priority over the others. They must all progress in a parallel fashion.
Not sequentially, but all at the same time. They have to be developed simultaneously.
Exactly. The manual explicitly warns that emphasizing one aspect too much, or excluding any of these efforts, can bring serious difficulties and, at worst, even failure. They all have to work together, be developed in balance.
And does it offer any proof for this?
It concludes with a simple, sweeping statement. The history of revolutionary wars has demonstrated this truth.
So the truth, according to this document, is that success in this type of warfare is fundamentally contingent on developing these sophisticated psychological and political operations alongside military action, treating them as equally vital components that must advance together.
Yes, that parallel development is absolutely key to the strategy outlined. The manual also includes, interestingly, an appendix. It's on oratorical techniques.
Oratory. Public speaking. Why add that?
It's framed as a complementary skill. something that adds to the persuasion techniques discussed earlier, specifically for those wanting to perfect their speaking skills. It calls oratory a valuable resource for leadership, an extraordinary political tool.
So the power of the spoken word, formally delivered, is also seen as a political weapon.
Definitely. It discusses understanding the audience, not just as individuals, but as a collective state of mind, influenced by emotions, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, and the environment. Effective oratory, because it's a shared, coincidental communication between speaker and audience, has to appeal to both sides of human nature.
Both reason and emotion.
Right. Thought, the mind, and feeling, the soul, as the manual puts it. Oratory appeals to reason through ideas and to emotions. But the leader, the speaker, needs to be sensitive to those collective emotions, but also somehow set apart, able to lead and control them. Judgment must prevail over emotion. It calls this the antithesis between heart and mind.
A detached manipulator of collective feeling. What are the objectives of political oratory according to the appendix?
It says it teaches, persuades, or moves the audience. Methods include appeals, commands, questions, and answers. It also makes a point of linking great political speakers throughout history. Cicero, Lenin, Hitler, Roosevelt are mentioned directly to political history itself.
Placing a high value on rhetorical skill. What makes a speech effective in this specific context according to the manual?
Brevity and succinctness are praised. The ideal is 5 minutes. A short speech shows ability.
Get in, make the point, get out.
Seems to be the idea. Speeches must be developed around a theme, have organized ideas, not just be a stream of words. And logic is stressed. Ideas must be logical, easily acceptable. But here's a crucial point. The speaker should not challenge the audience's own logic. That risks losing credibility.
Don't make the audience feel stupid or wrong.
Yeah.
Build on what they already believe.
Exactly. It recommends basing speeches on simple syllogisms, adapted to the situation. It gives this example. Those who enrich themselves while governing are thieves. The Sandinists have become rich while governing. Therefore, the Sandinists are thieves. Simple A plus BC logic. A speech lacking guiding ideas is seen as dispersed and confusing.
Using simple, relatable logic, often building on existing prejudice or belief, is there a recommended structure?
Yes, it outlines a mental plan that true orators supposedly use. It insists oratory isn't just improvisation. The recommended order is introduction or exordium, initial contact, grab attention with quotes, slogans, anecdotes, proposal, statement, define the subject, assessment, argument, present arguments, negative first, then positive with proofs, summing up, conclusion, brief summary, make conclusions explicit, and finally, exhortation, appeal for public action, encourage energetically.
That sounds like a pretty standard, almost classical speech structure.
It is, and it also touches briefly on using figures of speech literary resources borrowed for oratory, but it warns to use them in moderation, as excessive use sounds false.
What kind of figures of speech?
Various types. Repetition figures like anaphora, repeating the start of phrases, freedom for the poor, freedom for the rich. Or conversion, repeating the end, to build rhythm and emphasis, play on words. Using similar grammatical structures for rhythm, fighting will enter marching because who perseveres reaches. Synonymity, using similar words, without exceptions, without omissions. Background figures like comparison simile, free as a bird. And antithesis, contrasting opposites. They promised freedom, they gave slavery. Logical figures like concession, appearing to concede a small point to the opponent, or prolepsis, refuting an argument in advance, some will think, but Belial. And pathetic figures designed to appeal directly to emotion. Prayer supplication, Lord, free us. Implication of threat, direct threats. Apostrophe, addressing non-living things, mountains of Nicaragua. Interrogation, questioning self for emphasis. And insinuation, leaving a thought incomplete for the audience to finish, often negatively.
Wow, okay. So the appendix provides a detailed toolkit for crafting messages designed specifically to manipulate thought and emotion through carefully structured language and rhetorical tricks.
It absolutely reinforces the document's overall perspective on the fundamentally psychological nature of this struggle and the critical importance of effective, controlled communication at every level.
So, stepping back and trying to summarize this whole deep dive, this document presents a really stark model of guerrilla warfare. The central objective isn't land, it's controlling the human mind.
Right.
Psychological operations, integrated into absolutely everything from the individual fighter's mindset to meticulously stage-managed mass mobilizations, are viewed as the determining factor for victory. They have to operate in parallel with military action.
And the tactics discussed are, frankly, often disturbing.
Yeah.
turning fighters into propagandists, using seemingly benign actions alongside calculated violence for armed propaganda, employing dedicated persuasion teams using psychological principles, creating and controlling front organizations through manipulation and outright coercion, and then orchestrating mass gatherings using agitators, hired criminals, and even deliberately creating martyrs for propaganda value.
It's a strategic blueprint focused relentlessly, almost clinically, on shaping perception and controlling behavior, targeting the entire population, the enemy, and their own forces, often prioritizing the appearance of popular support over maybe genuine consent.
That's a fair summary of the strategy laid out in this manual, yes.
So if victory, according to this manual, is ultimately won by conquering the mind, potentially, as it says, without necessarily having received any shots, what does that tell you, the listener, about the nature of conflict and influence more broadly?
It certainly frames psychological operations not just as some side tactic, but as essential as combat itself in this context.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Especially today, in an age saturated with information, competing narratives, constant influence attempts. Where else in our world are these kinds of psychological battles being fought? Perhaps, as the manual implies for its context, without us even realizing we're on the front lines or who's pulling the strings.